Number 3, Canadian investors and political leaders love the Pacific Alliance countries, Chile, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, who we already went through. Let's think of Chile, Colombia, Peru. These are free trading nations with a Pacific focus. Mining is a key industry playing to Canada's strengths. What do you expect for these Andean nations? Our lead on this one is Eduardo, and our commenter is Rob.
Well, I think the Andean three embody what I see as a positive shift in Latin America. They're countries that managed to go from countries that reacted to what was going on in the rest of the world and in their economies in the 70s that led to continuous crisis, to countries that developed the capacity to think about what's going to happen in the forward, choose a path and get there. I think that's embodied in how they had massive windfalls over the past 10 years. China's entry into the WTO meant that their primary products, the commodities they produce, that had their prices go through the roof. But rather than going out and having a party like they did in previous decades, they saved it. They developed incredibly deep pools of domestic savings. They have fully funded pension systems with a very progressive system that even the US is debating about copying. For example, in Chile, the assets of the pension funds are almost the size of the GDP. And that has developed the capacity to invest in infrastructure and think about where they want to be in the future and move towards that. But it doesn't stop there. Even now, they're thinking, okay, commodities will not go to the favorable period that we saw in the past. That would mean that oil went in 2000 from $18 to 100 currently. I don't know anybody who currently thinks that oil will be at 500 in 10 years. So each country is going through a period of reflection and thinking, what are we going to do for the next 10 years? In Colombia, they've already said, we're going to use infrastructure and we're going to try to build a more diverse economy and focus on manufacturing like Mexico did. Carlos yesterday said he thinks he wants to focus on the Mexican model and become a manufacturing country, and they have the size for it. They have a stable economy, they have deep pools of domestic money to fund the infrastructure to develop their manufacturing base. Chile said, well, we have copper and we have commodities, but we know that commodities are very volatile and they can lead to Dutch disease. So what can we do? Well, we have an incredibly deep financial system. We can become a financial hub for the region. And with the development of the integrated stock exchange of those countries with Mexico, I think they can credibly become a strong financial hub in the region. They already have an integrated stock exchange of about $1 trillion if they include Mexico. So Chile is thinking forward, but it doesn't even stop there. They actually break the rule of don't fix what's not broken. Chile already has one of the fastest processes in the world to start a business. Just yesterday they announced we're going to launch a new internet application. You can actually register a company in one day. President Piñera is trying to import the entrepreneurs of the world, giving them actually free money if they establish a company and have a sound business plan. So I think the Andean three reflect that they're countries with incredibly sound fiscal stances. Most of them are net creditors or close to it. They have incredibly deep pools of domestic savings, which will be able to fund the infrastructure and the next drive after the terms of trade push they got over the past 10 years fade, and they're already planning for it. So I think the outlook for the Andean three, to me, is probably the strongest in the region.
Robert, I'm going to comment because you went so fast that
We're changing every rule.
Yes, every rule.
Venezuelan constitutional law. Everybody's going to get out.
Exactly. And also remind everyone that we're on Chatham House rules in this particular forum.
We're being filmed, actually.
Oh, well, and hopefully the Chatham House will be copy. So the story of the Andean Three, I think, is it sounds like a mafia gang, but actually it's actually a pretty good story. The thing I think is interesting about that, and picking up on Eduardo's comments, is that this isn't a natural state for a couple of these countries, particularly Colombia. And I think this is why it's so important that this integration actually be successful. So you've spoken already, Eduardo's spoken already about the stock market integration. But it's extremely important for Colombia, which is the larger of the three. And the reason is that Colombia, I alluded to Brazil's being isolationist. Well, Colombia is downright, autarkic. And its history it has to do with the way that the Spanish colonial efforts unfolded in the Americas and such. But essentially, Colombia has this very much a siege mentality. It has its biggest challenge as an investor is that it is very hard-boiled and extremely closed in upon itself. Anything that allows Colombia to breathe, to open, and to engage outside of its borders is a very positive thing. Because, as Eduardo said, from the point of view of the fiscal and monetary framework, you can't find two countries, Peru and Colombia, that are better run. Peru probably better run, I would argue, on the monetary side, than these two countries, including all the, Mexico, Brazil, all maybe with the exception of Chile. So if you put Chile, which serves the role of sort of the Singapore to their Malaysia, if you will, combined with the tendency that this kind of effort will cause the economies to look outside itself, particularly Colombia, which has received huge amounts of Chilean investment, particularly in the agribusiness area, which, of course, the Chileans are so very advanced, and the Colombians have all sorts of natural advantages, which I learned when I was there. There's no pests, apparently, at 6,000 feet. So, you plant anything and there'll be no pests. Who would have known? The Chileans knew, and that's why they're there. They're investing. So, this is, I think, a very, very, it's a story that's bigger than the sum of its parts. I think is really the story Eduardo was laying out, and I agree very much.
A lot of people forget the Caribbean, that there are some important Canadian interests in the region. The larger countries in particular are much more than tourism. What is the outlook for Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and the Dominican Republic?
Thanks, Michael. I work for, I work for Michael Leach, and I have the distinct pleasure for the last 10 years of the dubious position of always following Michael Leach as a speaker. So here I get to follow Jonathan Hausman as a speaker, and also follow the topics on Brazil and countries like Colombia. So I'll start off with just a segue on our experience in Colombia, and then come back to like we brought up Caribbean. Segue on Colombia. For the last few years, we've been going down to Colombia because we believe in the macro story of Colombia, and seeking out investments, getting to know the various folks there, understanding how things work. Our observation right now for the last while has been is every time I come back from Colombia, I feel like I've just been walking through a market where everybody's going, got one of these to sell you, got one of these to sell you, and everything seems to be on sale until you get the price, and then the prices are very expensive. So our observation just honestly is, boy, it's amazing to see everything on sale. I mean, from mines, concessions, utility, everything seems to be for sale. Prices exceptionally expensive, and then of course you run into the clothes, a bit of the clothes mentality. So the Caribbean, the analogy I'll give you on the Caribbean is there is a baby boom effect that will trickle down to the Caribbean that just keeps on coming. At one point, the baby boom effect on the Caribbean will be very, very large. But the question is when, and I'll come back to that in a moment. On the other side, what the Caribbean has, so it's got a large hangover from the recession. So very, very tourism-dependent countries like Jamaica, like the DR, like all of the smaller islands. And if you think there's a real estate hangover in the United States where housing has to get solved before the economy can really start to grow, the same tale exists, only it lags in the Caribbean. Basically, there's a large inventory that has to get digested. And that large inventory was built for the right reasons. It's built in anticipation of this baby boom demographic that will eventually cause much larger tourism demand in the region. That inventory has to get digested. So where are we in 2013? So our perspective would be that baby boom demographic, just to get a picture of how we see it, if the typical person, if a retiree, spends 2 weeks on average on vacation instead of 1, that's a doubling of the tourism demand for a region that is very tourism dependent. So just again, then you put health tourism on there and adventure tourism and ecotourism, you get a picture of what can happen. You've seen South Carolina, Florida, etc. But again, that has to get digested before the spillover happens in the Caribbean. But the multiplier, the leverage effect of a very large North America and a very small Caribbean means that there's a reason to be optimistic about the future. Where are we? The digestion has to keep happening. 2013 will be a difficult year for most of the countries. They're in the throes of IMF negotiations, most of them. So they're basically trying to survive through the recession and get to the point where the growth kicks up. And 2013, right, kind of is the bottom year. This is the year where it's probably not going to get a lot better for the next 6 months, 9 months. They got to get to another tourism season. And then after that, things should start looking up. And they've come this far into it, they should be able to make it through. But it will be a difficult 6 to 9 months followed, but after which, like I said, things should start to look up. Why the optimism? The front end of maybe being 65 years old. So you want to start seeing that part start moving towards Sunsand and Seymour. You've also got a returning diaspora. So one of the things is more Jamaicans living outside of Jamaica than there are living in Jamaica. They're also wealthier. It's a wealthier Jamaica that lives outside of Jamaica than in Jamaica. When those folks, where do they want to snowbird? They want to snowbird back in Jamaica. They don't want to snowbird in Florida. They don't want to snowbird in Arizona. So what they want to do is they want to snowbird in Jamaica. The same thing happens for Barbados. The same thing happens for a number of those countries. So when those snowbirds return with North American or European pensions back into those countries, that too creates a big lift. Again, those people are all starting to turn 65 because they emigrated into North America in the 70s. That's the larger flow. Like I said, back in 2013, what we have to deal with today, we have to deal with debt that is coming due, IMF negotiations, and surviving into 2014. But after that, we think things look pretty good.
Okay, John, who lives in Miami, you can see the Caribbean from his balcony.
I'm going to focus my comments on the DR where I visit regularly. You know, we've now been almost 6 months with the Danilo Medina administration, and one is struck by how much impact an individual can have on a small market like that. His predecessor, Leonel Fernandez, who this organization honored last year, is arguably the most successful president the country's had for the last 100 years. He was a great statesman. He was amazing at opening his country to foreign investment. He was very effective at managing the different interest groups in his country and passing legislation and reforms. Danilo Medina, by comparison, is about as exciting as wet cement. I don't know if any of you saw his speech at the Iberian Conference, where in his own language, he literally for 20 minutes sat head down and read his speech, while other heads of states from the region in Spain sort of, you know, chit-chatted one another because they were so bored by the guy. He has almost no political skills, but he is a good technocrat, and he is arguably honest and has the right intentions. He's also backed by one of the most powerful chief of staffs the country's ever had, Montalvo, who really is the power behind the throne in the DR. He essentially oversees every major spending item of all 18 ministries, and nothing gets by him. Now, Fernandez, his first administration was about turning that country around. If you recall, in 2003, they went through a devastating devaluation and a bank fraud. And he really turned things around and turned the reputation of the country around, so that when he entered his second term, and the world was beginning the financial crisis in 2008, he was able to convince the IMF to give him a line of credit, essentially an unsupervised line of credit, 3 times the normal size for his marketplace. And he took that money and he spent it on a massive investment expansion project across the DR. Much of it inefficiently spent, but nonetheless, it was one of the only economies in 2009 and 2010 in Latin America that grew. And so his sort of counter-cyclical spending really saved that country from feeling much of the recession. At a time when tourism was down, at a time when export manufacturing was down, at a time when real estate investment was down. So many of the pillars of the economy were falling, but public spending was rising. The end result of that was that when he left, the country, the next administration, which he didn't calculate would be his own party, he assumed that Hipólito of the PRD would win. And part of his strategy was to hand over an historic deficit to the opposition party in the hopes of coming back 4 years hence.